When you think of it, you realize that because when it's presented, they have the feeling to say that, as you say, Eric, that, the West, they came, the Chinese, they took over and everything. They took over what was ours and everything. But at the end, you look at them, they're still present. I think what they blame the Chinese for is the Chinese just adapted.
And what's interesting is that both of these new books have made it very clear that we are no longer wondering whether or not we are in a new Cold War, a revolutionary period, an era of great power competition. Both of these thinkers make it very clear that we're there now. This is it.
If we look at the old Cold War, in theory, African countries had some kind of traction in playing off the two sides against each other. Like that translated into massive destabilization of African countries and proxy warfare.
And the reality is that China has made significant investments across the African continent over the last 20 years. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana, and before the UN in 2018, said, look, you in the West criticize us for partnering with China. Where are the U.S. infrastructure companies? He has a point.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, and our Africa editor, Geronima, joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Guys, I've started two new books, not one, but two at the same time, and I'm a little bit in that mode of just trying to cram in as many. There's a book out by Fareed Zakaria. Many of you may know him from CNN, and he's been around for a long time, and he's very much a kind of a pop icon in the geopolitical field. And also at the same time, there's a brand new book out by veteran New York Times national security reporter David Sanger. And what's interesting is that both of these new books have made it very clear that we are no longer wondering whether or not we are in a new Cold War, a revolutionary period, an era of great power competition. Both of these thinkers make it very clear that we're there now. This is it. We need to get used to it. This period of the United States being the only hyperpower without peer competitors is over. The war in Russia and Ukraine has made it clear, and now also with Israel, Iran, and Hamas. One of the vectors of that competition that's playing out is the battle for critical metals and minerals. That's the stuff like cobalt, nickel, and lithium that power electric vehicles. It's used in all sorts of electronics and military tech. This, of course, for those of you who've been listening to our show for some time, and regular long-time listeners will know that it's a topic that we're very familiar with and one that we cover very closely on the program. And so if we accept the premise that we are now back in some kind of Cold War, this time between the United States and China, and I think it's really important to be sure. I mean, we really have to be very clear here. Not everybody agrees that we are. But just for the sake of our discussion today, let's go with that idea and that premise, with what both Fareed Zakaria and David Sanger are saying. Then we have to think about where this battle is going to be waged. Over and over again, in every region across the global south, the message is the same, that they don't want a repeat of what happened in the first Cold War. So whatever this new struggle is, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, all the countries there, none of them have said that they want to choose a side, and they don't want this to be a repeat of last time. But the reality is, Cobus and Geraud, that a lot of countries may not actually have a choice in the matter. Let me play you a little bit of sound, and I'd like to get your reaction from a discussion that took place last fall at the Wilson Center in Washington, where they brought together several experts to talk about China's critical mineral investments in Africa. And there were some remarks by a gentleman by the name of Claude Kembemba, who is the executive director of the NGO Southern Africa Resource Watch, and he wanted to make it very clear that the great power competition in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo is already happening.
Africa does not own its minerals. The DRC minerals, all those have been sold to foreign companies. So the country does not own them. Even when they say we are going to manufacture batteries, is from which minerals. Then they have to renegotiate mining contract to ensure that they do that. The contestation to access these minerals is between China and the West. In this environment of a dominant neocolonial system, is it possible to achieve a just transition for Africa in the current economic model? And I propose that we need to change, and the West needs to play a key role to ensure that we have global social justice in which Africa benefits. But the competition, in fact, is doing the opposite. Is increasing human rights violation, is increasing corruption. In fact, is reversing democracy. Because our leadership, to protect their power, are prepared to sell our minerals cheaply to the first comer who can protect their power. They are also prepared to sell it too easily to fund the next cycle of elections. So we are in a very difficult situation where I think the West must be able to lead and to ensure that China does not repeat the mistake that they made. And our advocacy and monitoring of Chinese companies is not necessarily that because China is bad, is that China should not repeat the mistake of the others.
Geraud Kabemba was really, in effect, talking about your country. What do you think of his assessment, very quickly?
I partially share his assessment on the situation when he says that we don't own those minerals. And when he said we don't own those minerals, I think he's referring to the fact that based on the current structure, the business structure of those mining companies and those mining projects, we do not share majority shareholders, allowing us to control the production and to have something to say on how those mining productions are happening. And that's where I agree with him in that context, yes. But in terms of pure ownership, we still have the ability to be able to control those mining projects, to even to counter those projects. But what he also saying, something that I agree with him, is the fact that the competition, the geopolitical context is reinforcing the bad governance that we find in those countries. Because when you have geopolitical agenda coming from outside, pushing for certain choice to be made by political leaders in those countries, like in DRC, you can find leaders are receiving support from various countries based on who they choose to pick. If they choose to pick maybe a country in the West, or they choose to pick China, they may receive political resources, political support from those countries, shielding them from any criticism when it comes to bad governance in those countries. So yeah, bad governance can be strengthened by the geopolitical context when it comes to the access of critical minerals in those countries.
Well, let's drill down now on that issue of critical resources that are so central to this discussion. A new report came out earlier this month from the United States Institute of Peace that tried to serve as a kind of wake-up call for the U.S. and what it needs to do to compete more effectively with China, specifically in Africa. The report is entitled Critical Minerals in Africa, Strengthening Security, Supporting Development, and Reducing Conflict Among Geopolitical Competition, and it was produced by a USIP senior study group, and we are thrilled to have one of the members of that group who co-authored the report to join us today from Washington. Terence McCulley, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Eric. Nice to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. Just very quickly, just to introduce you, you're currently a senior managing director for Africa at the advisory firm McClarty Associates. You're a senior visiting expert for West Africa at the United States Institute of Peace and a former U.S. ambassador to Mali, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire. So you bring a lot of experience to this. We're very happy to have you. Also, just before we get started, I also want to make it clear that you by no means did this work alone. You were joined by just a fantastic team of folks on the study group. Altogether, I think there were 9 of you, including Carlos dos Santos, who's a former ambassador from Mozambique to the United States, Jude Moore, our old friend on the show, senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, and folks like John Simon, also a former U.S. ambassador to the African Union. Now, normally, Ambassador McCulley, I would start this discussion by having you provide a quick overview of the report, but just because we're short on time, your colleagues at USIP have actually done us a little favor and produced a short 60-second overview of the report that I think can help us save a little bit of time. Here's your USIP colleague, Tom Sheehy, explaining the overview.
The U.S. economy and national security depend on a reliable source of critical minerals for electronics, medical supplies, and engines. Africa can play an important role in the supply chain, and mineral development can be done in ways that benefit the people of the continent. A new senior study group report from USIP recommends that the U.S. government sharpen U.S. Africa policy with a focus on critical minerals, empower African civil society and the media, enhance ongoing USAID programs to assist Africans with the rule of law and fiscal transparency efforts, tactically address Chinese mining in Africa, mobilize the private sector to strengthen African infrastructure, expand membership of the Mineral Security Partnership to include African partners, assist Africans in building technical capacity in the mining sector, support efforts to address artisanal mining challenges.
Now, Ambassador McCulley, those were the key takeaways. Help us understand, why was it necessary in the first place to produce a report like this?
Thanks, Eric. And I think Tom summed up the report's conclusions very well. I think there's a sense that there are multiple agencies in the U.S. government that are focusing on critical minerals. The critical minerals are a key part of the Biden administration's policy promoting a green energy transition. But there's a lack of focus and a lack of leadership. And so the real goal of the senior study group was to make recommendations that focus the U.S. government's attention and really to focus on how it can better and more effectively engage in Africa, where you have countries like DRC, which are obviously hugely important in the supply chain for cobalt, for example. So it's a way to think differently about how we engage in Africa and how we become more effective partners with African governments and peoples.
Ambassador, the private sector is a key partner here, particularly obviously the US private sector. And many of those companies have historically been a little hesitant to work in Africa. So I was wondering, what kind of conversations, you had with the private sector in doing this research? And from your perspective, what are some of the barriers and some of the incentives that could be used to pull greater private sector investment and involvement in the African mining sector?
Yeah, that's a great point, Cobus. And historically, the U.S. private sector, including the mining sector, has been reluctant to invest in Africa. The last U.S. company in DRC, I think, pulled out about a decade ago. It's seen as too hard, too risky, and corruption obviously is an issue. And I think one of the focus of the report looks at the U.S. development finance institutions, which are supposed to be supporting the private sector in Africa, and the recognition that our development finance institutions like DFC, USXM, to a lesser extent USTDA, are simply too slow to move. The private sector needs quick turnaround, they need rapid assessments, and in the mining sector, for instance, DFC can often take 12 to 18 months before it approves a project. So if the U.S. is really serious about getting the private sector back in Africa in a big way, whether it be in critical minerals or other infrastructure or really anything, we need to make sure that our development finance institutions, like our competitors, whether it's China or our European friends, are more closely aligned with our foreign policy objectives and are able to move quickly. Just as an example, in another sector, a U.S. company with a French affiliate went through the French development finance facility, got approval in 3 months. It would have taken DFC probably a year. That's just not fast enough for the private sector.
Ambassador, what would you say for those who believe that the US or even Western countries in general are ill-equipped and ill-structured to address those challenges that you mentioned when it comes to addressing China? Because you mentioned the fact that those countries like the US are really moving slow for the private sector when you compare with countries like China, because of the centrality of the government and how their political structure is set, they can really move quickly and take decisions quite fast. So do you believe that the US can make the changes, given that we come to agree that we are in quote-unquote Cold War situation, that the US can make the change that's required to move fast and to take decisions when it's needed, and much faster than it used to do now?
Well, that's a very difficult proposition in the current political environment in the United States. The US DFC was created out of OPIC via the BUILD Act. It was a bipartisan act of Congress, and to change the authorities, to change the structure of DFC would require additional action by Congress. And in an election year, in the current very polarized political environment, that's going to be different. That's going to be very difficult. I'm not sure I agree with the premise that we're in a Cold War. Certainly we're in a strategic competition with China in Africa. But I would say when you look at the commercial landscape, when you look at competition, we certainly, U.S. companies certainly believe that they face disloyal competition from China, which does not have the same approach to foreign corrupt practices and labor practices and environmental standards. But we're also in serious competition with the French and the Turks and the Germans and the Dutch, who have development finance institutions which are much more nimble. So I don't think it's just about China.
But when we talk about competition, it implies that there's two or more sides that are actually vying for the same thing. At this point, There is no American mining company in the DRC today, and we talk about the DRC only because of the huge amounts of cobalt that's there. We're not really competing yet. We're still talking about competing. There's reports like yours. There's a lot of movement on the Hill to talk about things, but we're not really there. And is that part of the discussion as well? We're not really in the competition. The Chinese are building upstream processing centers in Zimbabwe and Algeria and Nigeria. TFM is getting an injection of capital of $2 billion. I mean, the scale of what the Chinese are doing compared to what the Americans are talking about is really not comparable.
No, you're right. I mean, we talk about the $250 million investment in the Libido corridor to move critical minerals west instead of east. That's an important investment and it's significant. But you're right. I mean, there is, however, a significant Western-facing company in DRC. Glencore produces half of DRC's cobalt and a third of the global supply of cobalt. So there is a Western-facing company that is active in the sector, that is part of a number of responsible mining initiatives, from EITI to the Responsible Minerals Initiative to the Clean Cobalt Alliance. There is a vehicle for Western engagement, but you're right. The processing piece is dominated by the Chinese. I think 95% of manganese processed in China, 75% of cobalt and graphite, 80% of the cobalt that's used in EV batteries is processed in China, and that is a real issue. And I think that was one of the reasons behind the MOU, the Zambia-US-DRC MOU, that is encouraging the three countries to look at developing some part of the EV battery value chain in Africa, in Zambia or DRC.
Which that MOU, just for the record, has not moved forward out of the MOU stage and has effectively been stalled for almost 2 years now.
That's correct. There was a feasibility study that I think Afrexim funded, and unfortunately the conclusion of that was that it's difficult. You can stand up sort of the first or second stage of processing in Zambia or DRC, but it's a difficult proposition. That's certainly true.
Ambassador, when we read the reports and the recommendation in the reports, we can have and feel the sense that sense of like there's no really Cold War, but there is competition into the mix between the US and China in that sphere in Africa. My question to you would be, given the fact that you say there's no really Cold War, there's much more competition, do you believe that for those who are saying that, access to critical minerals are not only about security, there's also the component of climate change and energy transition, and those topics should never be like a part of geopolitical strategic competition? Do you believe that there will still be a grant and opportunity or even synergies for cooperation between China and the US in that sphere in Africa, especially when you take into account that many African countries, as Eric said in the beginning, they don't want to pick side between the US and China?
Yeah, that's an important point. And I think the report, actually one of the recommendations is that we need to be more nuanced in our engagement on the continent with China and not look at it as black and white, that we should not exclude from partnership companies that have a Chinese element or Chinese component. And we also need to take into account the reality that the Africans have said loud and clear, you can't tell us who our friends are. It was the famous, and Cobus probably remembers this, when Tony Blinken rolled out the U.S.-Africa strategy in, I think it was in Cape Town in 2022, essentially warning about the influence of China in Africa. And Foreign Minister Pandor, I think very quickly and rightly in my view, said, look, we're going to choose our partners based upon our own national interests. And the reality is that China has made significant investments across the African continent over the last 20 years. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana, before the UN in 2018, said, look, you in the West criticize us for partnering with China. Where are the U.S. infrastructure companies? He has a point.
You mentioned Glencore. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about to which extent you feel that China's really changed the environment in Africa. Many stakeholders raise corruption issues around China, rightly, corruption issues around Chinese involvement and environmental and social impacts around Chinese involvement, that many well-documented problems in that field. But Glencore in 2022 was found to have paid around $100 million in bribes to various resource holding governments. And the Canadian company Ivanhoe, which is a very large Western player in the DRC and, kind of a key Western, private sector Western ally to some of these initiatives, was found by Amnesty International to be guilty of human rights violations in a report in 2023. So to which extent do you feel this is an environment that was authored by Western power? And to which extent do you feel that China's really an outlier here?
In terms of labor standards and corruption, Cobus?
In terms of labor standards, in terms of corruption, in terms of environmental impacts, like to which extent can the West really make a claim to be changing anything when, to a large extent, they really shape the environment we're working in right now?
Well, perhaps. I don't think that Glencore necessarily shaped the business environment in the DRC. You look at the deals that President Kabila made with China with the promise of infrastructure projects which never materialized, and you look at the labor standards that are and respect for the environment that are carried out in Chinese mining operations in the DRC compared to Glencore. So I'm not sure that I agree that the West created this standard. And I would also say that the Glencore of the past is not the Glencore of today, which, of course, they paid a $1.5 billion fine as a result of an extensive DOJ investigation into corruption, including in the DRC. But I think if Glencore were here, and they did participate in one of the USIP sessions, Glencore were here, they would say that the Glencore of today is a different company, and that if you come to one of the mines in DRC, you would notice their differences than their mining operations in Australia or anywhere else. They've got a new CEO, they've got a new board, they have a new compliance department, which did not exist when the issues that you raised were carried out earlier in the 2010s. So I would say that the standards which Glencore is operating under now are consistent with standards that a U.S. company would be required to operate under.
One of the things that we did last year, and Geraud led this initiative, is we mapped the entire cobalt supply chain from mine to port. And it's a fascinating revelation. It's on our website in French and English. And one of the things that it revealed was that the Western companies, Ivanhoe, even Glencore to some extent, and many others, are all intertwined with the Chinese supply chains. And this also brings up this question of Western companies are not loyal to political allegiances in Washington, Brussels, Paris, Seoul, or Tokyo, Asian companies as well. We saw this with Tesla, for example, that has done deals with CATL. It's done deals also with Zhejiang Cobalt, Ford as well. They're going to follow what their board's interests are and their bottom line interests, not geopolitical considerations. So this emphasis in Washington, there's a lot of discussion about Western companies. Western companies haven't shown to be that aligned with, again, Western geopolitical priorities. How does that factor into some of the thinking in this report and in your own discussions with Western stakeholders and policymakers about this China question?
Sure. Well, the reality is that China has very cannily monopolized the processing of critical minerals. The report mentions, and I quoted some numbers earlier, 80% of the cobalt that is processed for EV batteries is done in China. So it's a commercial reality that Western companies, whether they're mining companies like Glencore or automobile manufacturers like Tesla and GM, the supply chain is the supply chain. And standing up a cobalt processing facility as a greenfield project would cost $300 billion and would take enormous amount of time. So I think you're right that some of the discussion in Washington, when you sort of the hand-wringing about China, it doesn't face the very real commercial reality that China has processing capacity for most of these critical minerals, and we will be reliant on that processing capacity for the foreseeable future.
Ambassador, in your reports and the recommendation, because you mentioned the timeline of those actions, I was wondering how this recommendation and suggesting the reports are factoring the mid and long-term solution to address the geopolitical context, the political economic context in those countries, in producing countries where you have corruption that led Glencore to do what it did in DRC. In the same time, addressing the urgency of the real politics of the US wanting to have access to those critical minerals now, because you also have the security component in that mix. So how do you mix the need of geopolitical reality now with the principle of we have to have good governance in those countries, not to repeat what we've seen before with the Glencore that happened before?
Sure. Well, I think certainly there is an urgency. And I think one of the observations of the senior study group was that there are lots of people talking about how urgent this is, and lots of people in Washington talking about critical minerals. But there is an absence of sort of one-stop shop, if you will, an absence of a single point of leadership to bring all that together, to translate the urgency of the need into concrete action and deploying resources. So that's one of the objectives of the report, is to highlight the urgency and highlight the lack of coordination, and to push gently and in conversations on the Hill and with the administration for a better and more coordinated and more strategic approach to this important issue.
All of this is happening in the context of the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which focuses a lot on trying to safeguard U.S. supply chains from Chinese involvement. In the report, as you say, there's a call for a tactical and nuanced kind of approach to possible Chinese involvement or Chinese dealings on the U.S. corporate side. But also there's a mention that the IRA has the potential of disincentivizing like U.S. involvement in this kind of sector. So I was wondering how you recommend they navigate this difficult landscape.
Right. It is true. I mean, the IRA can only be used with countries with whom we have free trade agreements or equivalents, and that doesn't include the countries that we're talking about in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that's why the report really kind of drilled down on the need for DFC to be reorganized and staffed appropriately so that it can move quickly to support private sector investment, because the IRA is not going to be the vehicle that is going to encourage U.S. mining companies or U.S. investments into infrastructure related to the supply chain in Africa. The DFC investment in the Leader Corridor is a good start, but there need to be a cadre of folk who understand the critical mineral sector built into DFC and our other development finance institutions. And you need to have staffing on the ground in these embassies to help carry out the policy. So I think that was why the report really focused a lot on restructuring DFC.
Well, you've touched on another problem for the United States Department of State is that a lot of their embassies in Africa are understaffed. So more staffing is a problem across the board for U.S. missions in Africa. The report is Critical Minerals in Africa, Strengthening Security, Supporting Development, and Reducing Conflict Amid Geopolitical Competition, produced by a senior study group at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And we were thrilled to have one of the contributors to that study group, Terence McCulley. Thank you so much for your time today. Terence is a senior managing director for Africa at the advisory firm McClarty Associates, and also a senior visiting expert for West Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. We really appreciate your time and your insights today, Ambassador McCulley.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
Cobus Geraud, always fun to talk with folks who've been on the ground for as long as Ambassador McCulley have. He has a lot of experience, a lot of insights. I really feel like this report, in many ways, is like a wake-up call. Like they're grabbing the Capitol by the collar and say, guys, you got to get in the fight. The United States loves to talk about these kinds of things. The U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit last year was talking about it, and they've been talking about more engagement in Africa. They've been talking about reforming the DFC for a long time. They've been talking about building the Leader Corridor. They've been talking about all of these different things. The MOU, Geraud, you and I have, we love to make fun of that MOU that's been around for almost 2 years now. And yet we just don't see the action. And subscribers to our newsletter, and we have a lot of State Department folks who read our newsletter every day, and those folks must get very furrowed brows because we track every minutia of the Chinese critical mineral supply chain in Africa, and the news is big. There are new processing deals. There are new mining deals. There's new EV distribution deals. I mean, up and down the supply chain, a lot on the Chinese side is happening. And yet we're stuck in neutral in Washington with reports like this, where I admire their intention. Don't get me wrong. I think that the authors of this report were very well intentioned, but in many respects, it feels like they're really singing into the wind here because it's hard to get people's attention in Washington to actually do stuff when people just like to talk about stuff a lot more. Cobus, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the problems. What struck me a little bit in this report is just overlap with some of the policy documents that I've seen coming out of both the different European powers and Japan, in the sense that they have a very strongly developed kind of focus on the need for critical minerals, the need to focus on the supply chains, all of that kind of aspect of it, with very little mention of, for example, kind of the need for broader based, electricity demand, for example, or they're responding to that demand in Africa. And, obviously, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that many people will say, hey, but those are two different things. I think they are actually artificially siloed in the discussion. And when, for example, like one sees it very clearly in some of the EU, these kind of projects around, say, green hydrogen in Namibia, for example, which is a German project, where there's a lot of talk about that green hydrogen, about developing it, about shipping it to Europe, about Namibia making money from it, but not not a word to say whether the town surrounding that installation will have electricity or not. So there's a blind spot, I think, in these approaches to what African countries actually need development-wise, that I think weakens this kind of cooperation between G7 members and the recipient countries. And I think for all of the strengths of the report, I don't think it addressed that issue.
Well, speaking of power issues right now, just another interesting kind of footnote to this, to your point, Cobus, is that Zambia State Power Utility, ZESCO, issued notices of force majeure this week, which means that they are going to be shutting down power in many of the country's largest copper mines. And so, again, this question of power is absolutely fundamental in terms of building capacity within the supply chain, because mining requires a lot of power, so does processing.
And just to make clear that this is obviously a really big priority on the African side, but more specifically, it's a space of potential cooperation between that would sweeten the deal politically on the African side. But that kind of quite, I think, practical and pragmatic political consideration is not being discussed at all in this, and that between G7 powers and African national governments, and it's revealing for me that there doesn't seem to be much awareness even of how much that could sweeten the deal for the G7 in this cooperation.
Geraud, I want to get your take on this G7 question that Cobus is bringing up, because in the time since the United States has launched this MOU, for example, in Zambia and DRC in the past 2 years, the Japanese have been coming into the mining sector quite aggressively. And you pointed out something very interesting, is that the Japanese in Botswana and now increasingly in the DRC actually have a track record of getting things done. And in many respects, it demonstrates that a G7 country can move faster, as the ambassador pointed out with Europe, that the United States is especially slow compared to even its G7 competitors, not to mention the Chinese.
Yes, they're quite slow when they want, but Japanese, when you take the case of the Japanese, for example, the Japanese, they also take quite long before moving. The project in Botswana took quite numerous feasibility study before getting it out of the ground. And let's keep in mind, Botswana is different from different African countries. They're really a good example of good governance and good environment and political stability, allowing them to move quite fast. When it comes to other countries with much more instability or much more difficult political landscape, they take much more time. It's quite difficult for them to move. And I think it's the same issues that many G7 countries and many G7 private sectors are finding difficult to overcome in countries like the DRC, the Zambia, the Angola, and elsewhere in Africa as well. But to the point what Cobus mentioned before about the electricity issues, it really talks to a much broader issue, the issue of like how much Africa agenda, how much the agenda of those African countries are parts of the negotiation and the strategy that the G7 are pulling out when they talk about with Africa. When they talk about the CRM, the Critical Resource Mineral Program in Africa, when they sign those MOUs, how much they factor in Africa agenda into the discussion. And when you look at those debates, and I've mentioned that before, when you look at all those debates, you realize that many African countries, even producing countries overall in the global south country, do not have a specific or comprehensive political strategy when it comes to critical mineral resource. They do not have that, but G7 countries do have. Europe and US, Japan now has as those policy, but when they come to Africa, when they send those MOUs, they just come and meet emptiness in terms of strategy, in terms of like, what do you want? What are your demands? What do you need on the table? At the end, we really dance the tango that's still sung in the West and the G7 countries. And I think we should really broaden the discussion of asking what's our own strategy into this topic and what we really want to get out of this cooperation that we're having with China or even with the G7 countries.
But part of the problem here may be the U.S. approach, and that the U.S. wants to be more inclusive. It wants to bring in all sorts of different stakeholders, civil society, media, environmental, government, and that is potentially a problem. It sounds great, but I remember Kyle McCarter, who's the former U.S. ambassador to Kenya, when he was trying to get Bechtel to build the Mombasa to Nairobi highway, and they brought in more stakeholders, and what happened? The cost went up because people wanted more money in their pockets. And we've heard from stakeholders involved in this MOU that it wasn't the Americans who struggled to get this thing done. It was the Zambians and the Congolese that weren't that interested in it. And so the process, the way that the Americans may be going about this may be problematic because they want to open the process up, but that slows things down. Think about it in the United States. To get anything done in terms of infrastructure is a tedious process because everybody gets a stake. Everybody has a say. You can sue your way to delay things and whatnot. And so we can't get things done in the United States that way. And it's starting to show up in places like Africa as well, that it's difficult to get things done. So I wonder if the Chinese approach, lacking transparency, very opaque, oftentimes, again, with suspicions of high levels of corruption, but they actually are able to get things done. Cobus, what do you think about the question of approach between the US, the Chinese, the Europeans, and others?
I think it's easy to overstate the differences in approach. I see what you say in terms of the stated intention of Western governments to pull in all these civil society, kind of actors and so on, be more inclusive, sure. I mean, that is the line from Western governments. But Western power is hydra-headed, right? Kind of Western power. So the narrative that the West has somehow retreated from the African mineral scene and now the Chinese took over, that's a false narrative. Western power has been very, very present all over the African mineral sector. And
let me just clarify one important point there on this. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So there is a myth, one of the many myths about the Chinese in Africa is that they've taken over African mining. And Geraud has this great chart that he shares and we use in our presentations, that when we add up total mining exports from Africa, it amounts to about 7% of the total. And remember, Cobus, we did an interview a number of years ago with a Kenyan scholar on this, and she brought that up as well, and Nzetsewere, and that it's highly distorted, that Anglo-American alone exports more out of Africa than all Chinese entities combined.
Exactly. But the narrative is poor little ethical us. We've been pushed out of this, corrupt field by these evil Chinese. So that is a narrative that is what? Aimed at then doubling like US and other Western involvement in the sector on the base of an already a dominant position, right? That is actually what we're talking about. So that then, I think, is a very different question in the context of geopolitics, right? Because in the end, if we look at the old Cold War, in theory, African countries had some kind of traction in playing off the two sides against each other. In reality, what that translated into massive destabilization of African countries and proxy warfare. So the question, I think, in many Africans' minds is that where we're heading? Because already the narratives are so divorced from the actual presence of Western capital in Africa. So that it raises a lot of questions about what people are actually talking about.
Exactly. What Cobus said really made sense, and it's really something that we should be looking into in a way that when you think of it, you realize that, because when it's presented, they have the feeling to say that, as you say, Eric, that, the West, they came, the Chinese, they took over and everything, they took over what was ours and everything. But at the end, you look at them, they're still present. They're kind of, I think what they blame the Chinese for is that the Chinese just adapted. They adapted. What the ambassador says, like, the Glencore of today isn't the Glencore of yesterday. I was about to say, yeah, it's easy for Glencore to say we are not the Glencore for yesterday because you're already in the game already. You already have the pie. The thing is different. If the sanction was like, okay, we're punishing you, we're going to be sanctioning you and punishing you by taking back what you've taken after paying bribes, I bet the reaction in the West would have been different, because they would have understood that, wow, yes, we're punishing Glencore, but the punishment is too harsh. To remove the mining concession they took by bribing the Congolese official is kind of harsh, and we'll be losing our foothold, our minus foothold that we have a country in the DRC. So it's a very kind of, I wouldn't say sanctimonious, but it's a very complex and nuanced view, and I appreciate that report, because when you read the report, you realize that they come with the reality that we cannot just play the principles. You also have to take into account the real politics of the game on the ground to know how you're going to be able to play that game.
Cobus, since I know you like narrative so much and you've been talking about narratives and the woe is me American and Western mining narrative, let me read you some comments that came out of Perth, Australia this week from none other than U.S. Ambassador Carolyn Kennedy. And she was at the PayDirt 2024, isn't that a great name? PayDirt. The PayDirt 2024 Battery Mineral Conference. And here's what she said. She said, Australia's Minister for Resources, Madeleine King, is a tireless advocate for international standards that protect the health and safety of workers and the environment, rather than allow unchecked exploitation by state-owned Chinese companies in Indonesia and elsewhere. We can't let them destroy vulnerable communities and markets for Australian minerals under the guise of economic developments. Here's the best part. Commodities you manage are not only the basis for our economies, our future national security and the health of our planet depend on them as well, and they are under assault. There you go. That is the narrative right there, that it is the West that is saving the environment. And here's the funny thing to say something like that in Australia. Okay.
The irony of it.
Oh, no, the irony is rich because when you look at a company like Rio Tinto and you look at the Australian mining companies in Africa, and Canadians are the same, okay, that they get a way to say this stuff with a straight face is effing shocking. The amount of money that they take out of Africa compared to what they put into Africa is mind-numbing, okay? And they have the gall to talk about destruction. I mean, listen, I'm not defending the Chinese in Indonesia. We have covered what the Chinese have done in the nickel smeltering up and down, and it is horrific. But to put yourself out there as some kind of protector of the disenfranchised, the environment, and suggesting that the planet depends on Australian and U.S. leadership in mining is absurd at the level. I mean, it is just absurd. And I mean, so these narratives are just, there it is, right in, that was just this week, Cobus.
Yeah, it's notable. I mean, for all of the, I mean, there's many bad things one can say about the Chinese, and particularly the Chinese in nickel refining in Indonesia. It's a complete nightmare. But the thing is, the Chinese, in all of these countries, the Chinese are newcomers. They came into an environment that was already shaped by Western power. Like, their playbook is taken from the Western playbook. It may well be the Western playbook from a few years ago, you know, but still, that is a Western playbook. You know, that kind of historical legacy isn't being acknowledged, and I think it really should be acknowledged.
Yes, and that Western playbook is just like, now I think they're just mad, as I said earlier, they're just mad now. The Chinese just adapted to the game. They just find a way to play the game in their advantage. And now that the game is rigged against them, they don't know how to come back into the game, and it becomes more complex. So it's question how, as I said, as the ambassador, how do they reconcile the fact that they need to change the game? Because the game that needs to be changed by changing the governance and the political economic structure that we do find in those producing countries. And this takes you a long time. How do you change that in the same time, reconcile the need that you do have right now to access those minerals under the current circumstances? This is, for me, I think, the cognitive dissonance that they're having right now. And this is the difficulties they're going to have to face. Like, how do we reconcile the both of them in the same time? How do we move forward knowing that we have the urgency and also the principle that we want to uphold and we want to put on the table?
You know, we showcased this report earlier this week on our site, and I had a reader who came to me via email and said, Eric, do you think that USIP would have done this report if China wasn't in Africa? And I'm going to hold off on my answer. I want to get both of you. Let's say no China in Africa. Everybody else is there, everything else, but the Chinese aren't present. Does USIP write a report like this? Cobus, what do you think?
Yeah, possibly. I think they may, because, you know, even if China isn't involved, critical minerals is still a big thing, right? It certainly, the Chinese involvement certainly changes the calculus, the field that the report works in. But, you know, kind of, I think the climate crisis alone, and particularly the knock-on effects of the climate crisis on, you know, vulnerable societies, I think would necessitate this kind of research. You know, the timing or the framing also may be different, but you know, but I think that it's still important work.
Geraud, what do you think? This report, China not there, China there, what do you think USIP would have done?
I don't think they would have done the report. I think they would have done it differently, very different angle and different approach, because the report is very much centered around Chinese and around the competition around China and everything. Without China in the mix, the report would have come, but in a very different notes, very humanitarian notes. We wouldn't have had that geopolitical note and notes into that report and every other report that we've read before. So I think that the China factor puts that report on the map and made it something worth mentioning for Africa and to mention Africa into the mix. But I don't think that without China, I don't think that USIP or any other think tank in DC would have gone their way to really publish those well thought reports with Africa in mind as the center player.
That was my take as well, Cobus. I don't think they would have done the report, or they would have done it very differently. But I think this whole narrative of supporting development, for example, that is in contrast to, that's exactly what Carolyn Kennedy was saying in Australia, that the Chinese are exploitative and we're not. And the reference to geopolitical competition obviously is a nod to China. Even though the report is not very China-centric, my thought is that I don't think they would have been as focused on this issue without China. Not only USIP, DC writ large. DC writ large, I think that's what they've done. Gentlemen, let's leave the conversation there. Always fun to talk battery metals. Geraud and I are planning some really cool things later in the year on battery metals. We're kind of EV battery metal nerds, and so we've got some really neat things coming later in the year. And then also the three of us, we're very excited about this. We're going to be in Washington later this summer in the month of July, and we're really looking forward to meeting everybody. So that'll be a lot of fun. I think it's Geraud, you have never been to Washington before, have you?
No.
And Cobus, have you been to DC before?
Yes. I quite like it. It's very cool to walk around in.
It is wonderful. And in the summertime, it's especially fun. Everybody's out on the mall. It's really a great place. And I actually love DC in very short bursts, like I go every summer. So we're just making our travel plans now. And we're going to reach out to some folks. We might even do a couple shows from there and maybe even have a meetup to see everybody. So if you're in DC in the month of July, we'll give you some more information later in the year. Of course, if you want to support the work that we're doing, we'd be so grateful. We need the support. I'll tell you, like every media company out there, it is not easy. We go from day to day. And we've got teams in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This work is not free. It's very important. Cover the mining industry and EV battery metals pretty much better than anybody except the dedicated agencies like Benchmark, who, that's all they do. And so if you really want to find out about what's happening in the DRC with cobalt, Geraud's analysis is second to none. It's really, truly fantastic. And so if you'd like to get that, that's available to subscribers at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Try it free for 30 days. See if you like it. We're going to be launching a brand new research hub later with Cobus and Geraud's and everybody's work there too. And that will be available to subscribers as well. If you are a student or a teacher, you can get half off. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I'll send you the links for the 50% off discount rate. So we'd love to have you part of our growing reader community around the world. So for Geraud in Mauritius and Cobus in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much. We'll all be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.